So, welcome everyone to this event hosted by the British-Yemeni Society. Organising events on Yemen is one of the key things that we do, usually around 5 a year. But this is the first time we've done one online with contributions speaking directly from Yemen, in this case from both Sanaa and Aden. It's an important event to be holding at this time. We're now 5 years into Yemen's civil war, which has left the country's population highly vulnerable. COVID-19, the subject of tonight's event, comes on top of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with massive population displacement, high levels of malnutrition, extensive war damage to infrastructure, including health facilities and water supplies, and a number of public health crises, including cholera and diphtheria. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr Sahl Eleryani. He's a Sanaa-based public health doctor. He's acting executive director for the Medical Mercy Foundation and was a member of the cholera response team in 2017. And more recently, he headed the team establishing Yemen's national strategy for coronavirus response. So Dr. Sahl is uniquely placed to explain the situation to us on the ground, and he'll give us an overview of the situation overall in Yemen, but also Sanaa in particular, as well as a summary of the response and what is needed now.
Okay. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank all those who are attending this conference today, those who are supporting our cause and those who are working behind the scenes to support Yemen in this unprecedented crisis. Dear ladies and gentlemen, as you might be aware, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains the worst in the world, driven by more than 5 years of conflict, economic collapse, and breakdown of public institutions and services. Nearly 80% of the population requires some form of humanitarian assistance and protection. 10 million people are stepped away from famine and 7 million people are malnourished. The scale, severity, and complexity of needs in Yemen are staggering. As the crisis enters its 6th year, some 24 million people, 80% of the entire population, continue to require some form of assistance or protection, and close to half of all families are in acute need. Over 230 of Yemen's 333 districts are food insecure. Conditions in these districts are the worst in the country. 103 districts are at risk of famine. 41 districts have malnutrition rates above 15%. 54 districts have acute wash deficits, and 46 districts are at high risk of cholera. Intensifying conflicts are compromised access to health care, while there are ongoing risks of cholera, malaria, dengue, and other disease outbreaks. More than half of Yemen's health facilities are closed or partially functioning. Since 2015, parties to the conflict targeted not only medical facilities but also medical personnel, as health workers have been threatened, injured, abducted, detained, and killed. Consequently, many medical professionals have fled Yemen, further damaging the ability of the healthcare system to respond to a pandemic. Unlike air strikes and bombardments, COVID-19 casualties will be even more difficult to control. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Yemen, with its limited resources, has put together a strategy, guidance, and emergency plan included all. We do recognize that this is a challenging task. However, I am sure that we together here today to support the resilient people of Yemen to conquer this unprecedented crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, in Sanaa alone, a lot of people infected by COVID-19 patients with a mortality rate is 20%. In addition to this, a sudden increase in people mortality in which we don't have the ability to confirm cases and investigate the causes of their death. This spike overloaded the health system to near a collapse status. At the beginning of June, 40 out of 47 hospitals in Sanaa lost their ability to manage a sudden outbreak until Ministry of Health reopened them under its support. Now all these hospitals are full of enough ICU ventilators, which cover only 5 patient requirements. There is 10 governorates out of 21 governorates in Yemen recorded a lot of cases and high mortality rates. It's recognizable that many of your countries and organizations here provide lifeline assistance to millions in Yemen, but more support is needed to tackle the crisis, especially as the threat of COVID-19 puts even more lives at great risk. Dear ladies and gentlemen, this is a crisis layered on top of crisis, and the situation getting out of hand. People are on the brink. We must step now to save lives. We are here only the hope of millions. Our message to the world is clear. Look away now, and the consequences will not be less than catastrophic. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Yemen urgently requires 179 million through 6 months of 2020 needed for life-saving operation needed to conquer COVID-19. Yemen urgently required 45 million through 6 months of 2020 needed for air more ventilator, which currently stands at 300 units in the whole country. Yemen urgently required 50 million through 6 months of 2020 needed to get more ICUs, which currently stand at 52 units in the whole country. Yemen urgently requires 40 million through 6 months of 2020 needed to get more isolation units, which currently stand at 25 units in the whole country. Yemen urgently required 25 million through 6 months of 2020 needed to prevent likelihood of a surge cases, which will be overall health capacity. Yemen urgently required 20 million through 6 months of 2020 to increase virus testing, which currently stand at less than 6,000 tests performed in the whole country, with only 6 PCR machines. Finally, Yemen urgently required 3.5 million through 6 months of 2020 to save lives, to prevent famine, and to conquer COVID-19, the new world unfortunate reality. Thank you.
But let's move on. If people can hear me, I'll just repeat the instruction I gave to Sahar Gameel, Executive Director of the Yemen Center for Human Rights, based in Aden. She's a journalist. She's a professional, development professional, focusing on communities and social cohesion. She will cover for us the situation in Aden, how the virus and response have developed and how the response is going. Now, she's asked that her points are presented by Taher Qassem, British-Yemeni Society Vice Chairman. So I'm going to ask Taher to present.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sanaa, for asking me to present your paper. And this is on behalf of you. Yemen is suffering from the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the United Nations report, due to the conflict and war since late 2014. This paper is talking specifically about the Aden situation. The situation in Aden is confusing due to internal conflicts, and that local authorities are controlled by individuals who impose their presence in support of armed militia, and they are not bound by the law. The party who actually control Aden possess military power and militia. They recently announced their takeover of power under the name of self-management. The absence of the governmental role is because it is based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, as their main headquarters. In short, we can say that the Saudi coalition, who committed themselves to bear responsibility for the situation in Aden, are actually not there. I will address some of the difficulties that are directly related to the current situation of coronavirus. The deterioration of health and other public services due to the war. The financial allocation transferred from the government to combat the virus is used as rewards expenses instead of using them for what is meant for. Both private and governmental hospitals are not equipped to deal with coronavirus. The private hospitals has to think about their profit. Even when some of the private sector tried to contribute to providing equipment for protecting governmental hospitals, it was politicized between the government and the South Transitional Council, each one blaming the other about the failings. The emergence of many diseases that led to the deaths within hours without knowing the nature of these diseases and the causes. Governmental and private hospitals and health centers were not able to provide even the minimum preparedness due to the deteriorating conditions of these health facilities. The floods that swept Aden in March and May of this year revealed the fact that the environmental situations deteriorated in Aden. Many lives were lost as a result of the spread of these diseases. And then came the outbreak of the coronavirus to sweep the world, and Aden was no exception. There was no transparency and accurate information from the authorities about coronavirus. This helped the spread of the virus quickly, and some citizens did not believe that the coronavirus do exist in Aden. The number of deaths recently increased for people suffering from chronic disease in light of the total refusal of the government centers, hospitals, and private centers to admit them for fear they are carrying the disease. People did not know what to do or where to go to make their points. For example, the family of a 7-year-old Hannah did not expect this day to come, when most Aden hospitals refused her for treatment for fear of being infected with the virus. Hannah was suffering from malaria and fever. She had also problems with breathing. The family took her to 5 health facilities. The first was the Friendship and Republic Hospital. They gave reasons that they were on strike. Then they took her to a Saidi hospital, then a Naqib, then the German, then a Shifa hospitals. All gave reasons that they had no artificial respirators. Finally, she was admitted in the Gulf of Aden hospital when it was too late. She died hours after her arrival. With the widespread of epidemic diseases in May, people became reluctant to go to receive treatment in the quarantine centers for fear that they will die. The rumors and fake news spread fast that if anyone enters the quarantine centers, that person will die, will be dead. It is a major tragedy that when suspected case is detected, no screening is done to the family and friends who accompanied the patient. They simply do not have the PCR test. In Aden, many of the families of the patients pay for the necessary medicines themselves, and they buy them from private pharmacies. As a result of coronavirus, the living condition worsened in Aden. The national currency continued to collapse against foreign currencies. This led to high cost for food, and it increased the level of poverty in a very frightening way. This also coincided with the cessation of humanitarian assistance and the departure of many international organizations. There is a staggering rise in the number of deaths due to coronavirus and other diseases. The number of deaths in May was 1,864. The deaths per day was 100, according to the statistics of civil registry in Aden. Graves workers could not cope. They used buckling excavators to dig more graves in Daoud Cemetery in Dar Saad district in Aden. A video clip on social media showed the grave worker Abdullah at the cemetery in Crater Aden threatened to close the cemetery due to the increased number of deaths, and he had no personal protection equipment. The Ministry of Public Health and Population issues its daily report by the Supreme National Committee on Coronavirus on its Facebook page, where the figures are inaccurate. For example, on the June 17th, the total number of cases were 207, and the number of recovered were 177, and the deaths were 30. That was for all the 9 governorates in the country under their control. In comparison, MSF received 288 patients, 99 of whom died within 3 weeks between 30th April and 23rd May 2020. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Taher. That's very clear, and my goodness, what a tragic situation is developing. So look, moving on quickly to Iona Craig. Many of you will know her. She's a British-Irish investigative journalist. If you can't hear me, just indicate in the chat box, please. She was previously Yemen correspondent for The Times. She's the UK link for the Yemen Data Project. She's recently back about a month ago from a 4-month trip to Yemen, mainly in Aden and Marib, where she saw Yemen's coronavirus unfolding in its early stages. So she saw it at that time. And she'll be talking about the spread of the virus and the constraints imposed by 2 things, really. One, the political fragmentation in the country, and secondly, by Yemen's economic challenges, which of course have now been heightened by the situation in neighboring countries, i.e. a knock-on effect in terms of remittances and so on. So Iona, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, James, and to all of the British-Yemeni Society. I think we probably heard quite a lot from voices in Yemen already about the situation with COVID-19. So there was something, sort of 2 other things really that I wanted to try and cover. And one thing that was quite clear in the time that I was in Yemen for 3 months, even before COVID-19 arrived and after, was the issue of remittances. As the rest of the world starts to feel the impact of the pandemic before it arrived, officially at least anyway, in Yemen, people were already having problems with family members working abroad, not being able to send money back home because of business closures, lost jobs and work, and people being furloughed around the world, but particularly in the region. The majority of the Yemeni expats sending money back home in the form of remittances are in the GCC, and it's estimated around 61% of those are in Saudi Arabia. And it was quite clear from talking to families in Aden that they were already feeling the impact of that in March. As businesses were closing because of mitigation measures in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE and other parts of the Gulf as well. Now, the issue of remittances really is important, not just for those families, of course, that are receiving that money. The estimates of what that money is worth is somewhere between $6 and $10 billion per year. The official World Bank figures put it at over $3.5 billion, but that only accounts for money that goes through the official banking system. And as I think probably most people in this meeting know, that very few Yemenis hold bank accounts. And so that doesn't include many of the money exchanges and the Hawala agents and the other ways that people get cash to Yemen to their families. So yeah, the best sort of estimates put it at somewhere between 6 and 10 billion, let's say for argument's sake, 8 billion worth to the economy every year. And that foreign currency inflows is worth more than all other foreign currency inflows into Yemen. So more than humanitarian aid, oil revenue put together. And so not only is it important to those families on the ground who are no longer getting that money, but it's also an extremely important source of foreign currency. And without it, it puts a huge amount of pressure on the Yemeni economy, which is already struggling because of the conflict. Now, one of the biggest issues is to do, obviously, with the currency fluctuations in the value of the Yemeni rial. The Saudi deposit that was put into the central bank of $2 billion back in 2018 in order to effectively subsidize the exchange rate in order for importers to be able to import food and goods, food being the most important of those things, the basic foods to be brought into Yemen, and goods now, particularly obviously with COVID-19, with heavy demand for particularly medical equipment. Now that money has all but vanished now. There's around 200 million left at the end of May of that deposit. And without the foreign currency from remittances as well, we're looking at a serious devaluation of the Yemeni rial without that foreign currency to support the exchange rate. So what does that mean? I suppose for everybody on the ground, we're going to be looking at devaluation of the currency, rising food prices, which are already rising because of global conditions in the pandemic. And you're also looking at, the wider economic issues now as well, because there is no other source of income really for Yemeni families. There's still the issue over salaries not being paid. And at the same time now, whilst the remittance inflows have dropped massively, from speaking to money exchanges and banks, whilst I was reporting on this, from Al Karami, they saw initially a 70% drop in remittances in March from Saudi Arabia into Yemen. Now that leveled out somewhat because initially people obviously weren't able to get to the money exchanges to physically hand over cash to send it back home. When people were then able to do that online and electronically, figures improved a bit and the drop reduced to 50%. But this still is an ongoing issue. I think certainly with the month of Ramadan, that puts things on pause slightly because it's the time of year, obviously, when people are donating money or money is coming from charity, where people are able to find other sources, perhaps temporarily, to cover them for that month. So we may not see the impact of it really playing out for the next few weeks or months in Yemen. But yes, what's happening again at the moment, whilst this reduction in remittances is happening, we have very low global oil prices. So the small amount of oil that was being exported from Yemen is worth even less. But also the issue with humanitarian aid. As everybody is probably aware, there is a serious issue with defunding now, and many of the UN agencies are in the process of closing programs and projects because of a lack of funding. And the recent donor conference in Geneva, which fell over 1 billion short on what they were trying to raise for humanitarian aid in Yemen. So many of those families that are losing that income from remittances would fall into the bracket of then needing humanitarian support, are going to be struggling to get that humanitarian support because of the closure of food programs and other agency work that they would otherwise be relying on. So there is a serious concern now on the humanitarian impact of this. Just at the time when humanitarian aid is being reduced in Yemen, is happening at the same time as this issue of remittances. And that is likely to have a huge impact on people's purchasing power, their ability to buy food for their family members, whilst food prices are rising at the same time. And it's something, we've seen in Yemen since 2015 or 2016 is this issue of food physically being available in markets, but people not being able to afford to buy it. And I think at the moment, we should expect to see that even more so now, with people struggling to be able to purchase that food that is in the markets, and equally because of the issue of stability of the currency and the lack of foreign currency in the country, that is going to have an impact on food imports as well. And that kind of brings me on to the second thing that I wanted to say, we'll speak about really, which is related to the fracturing of Yemen, but it's not as simple as the geographic elements of it, because this is now, the divisions have been embedded again along economic lines, really. So most immediately, there is, the clarity between the north and the south, but there's also divisions within the coalition-controlled territory, which means Yemen is now, in effect, multiple statelets. And that is really being cemented as time goes on by economic division as well. So we know about the issue of the divided central bank, if you like, but you've also got effectively married almost an autonomous region in its own right, economically at least. Aden similarly, with recent issues over money that was due to go to the central bank, not ending up in the central bank. And so the division, whilst it's very difficult for Yemenis on a practical basis moving around the country, even before the COVID-19 restrictions, which closed the major routes for civilian traffic between the north and the south. The actual lasting impacts of that now really are going to be harder to break because of the economic ties that are binding people and economic interests, if you like, into those mini statelets. And what does that mean, I suppose, going forward really is that any kind of political solution, any kind of political deal that is done to end the conflict needs to disentangle those economics or those economic interests from those geographical regions. Because what incentive is there for those benefiting financially from these divisions? What incentive is them for the conflict to end, to find a political solution? There isn't really. So if a political solution doesn't include those economic elements and the economic realities that are on the ground, then it isn't going to be a lasting solution. It's really only going to be papering over the cracks. And as we've already been hearing, the situation with COVID-19, the humanitarian situation is only worsening right now. But the economic situation is also declining with it and becoming more fractured as well at the same time. And those two things really go hand in hand. Yes, COVID-19 is spreading anyway, but the humanitarian crisis that already exists is only going to get worse as the economic situation gets worse, and as we see continued economic fragmentation that is obviously very much linked to the political situation in Yemen, but also the fracturing of the conflict as a whole. I'm going to hand over now because I think I've probably already filled up my time.
Well, thank you so much, Iona. Can everyone hear me? Yes. No, thank you so much. It's so good to have your experience not only over so many years, but also somebody who's been there recently and can confirm the pictures that we're getting from the Yemenis themselves. I think the best thing is to move on straight away to our last speaker, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So our last speaker is Dr. Luca Nevola. He's a researcher at the University of Sussex. He's got a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Milan Bicocca, and he's speaking from Bergamo in Italy. So I hope the connection works better than some of those Yemen connections. Bergamo is the town, I'm told by him, that it's the worst hit town in Italy for the coronavirus pandemic. So clearly a lot of difficulties there. Luca has done much work analysing the Houthis as a movement and as a political force based on, I think, three years of field research in Yemen and the area around Sanaa. He's currently working for ACAPS, Yemen Analysis Hub, and ACLED. My camera's off, but I could show you the paper he wrote with Thanos Petouris. And we've asked him to comment particularly at the Houthi narrative of the COVID crisis. We've heard from previous speakers about how this issue has been very politicized, but now he's going to home in particularly on how the Houthis, who control the majority of the populated areas of the country, how they assess it. So over to you, Luca.
Yes.
I'm going to turn off my own microphone.
Thank you, everyone. Can you see my screen? My presentation?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. So first of all, let me thank the organizers and who invited me, with Thanos George Bernard Shaw, whose name I'm sure is familiar to all of you, wrote in his book, The Doctor's Dilemma, that, I quote, "The characteristic microbe of a disease might be a symptom instead of a cause." Indeed, infectious diseases always have wider environmental and social causes. And in this view, natural disasters are less natural than we might think. And the coronavirus in itself is but one factor among many in determining the lethality of the ongoing pandemic. So far, only 4 cases of COVID-19 have been officially recorded by the health authority of the Sanaa-based government. However, the situation appears tremendously serious. According to the WHO, less than 50% of the health facilities are now functioning at capacity, and Hossein Makbouli, head of the Supreme Committee for Epidemics Control, admitted before the outbreak that the health system was already collapsed. Overall, it seems clear that Houthi authorities are intentioned not to investigate cases of COVID-19 in areas under their control. The Minister of Health, Taha Al recently justified this strategy by affirming, "We are not dealing with the disease in terms of numbers, we deal with it in human terms." This approach is solidly underpinned by narratives produced by the leader of the Houthi movement, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. On the 21st of March, on the occasion of the anniversary of the death of Hussein al-Houthi, Abdul Malik, his brother, delivered a televised speech, and for the first time he overtly addressed the COVID-19 pandemic, articulating his narrative on 3 main levels. Religious, referring to the Quran; political, individuating an enemy and the strategy of war; and broadly ethical, juxtaposing Western and Islamic civilizations. In what follows, I shall explore these 3 levels. Firstly, moving from Quranic verses, al-Houthi affirms that most disasters, epidemics, and calamities are the outcome of human actions. This principle closely resembles a pillar of Zionist theology, namely the idea that God only writes what is good. From this tenet descends the principle of human accountability and the idea that evil is the outcome of human free will. Moving from this assumption, al-Houthi argues that, I quote, "The corruption that occurs on land and seas, that strikes the climate, the animals, the environment, the plants, it descends from the wrong actions of certain human beings who are not guided by God. Human beings are consequently held accountable for turning God's creation into a source of danger. Danger is not attributed to fate, but rather to human agency. This principle apparently resembles the ethical stance of many believers around the world, prone to interpret natural disasters as a consequence of unethical behavior. For instance, more than 1 century ago, a natural disaster struck the Zaidi areas of the belt of Sanaa, including the village where I conducted fieldwork. The community reacted by issuing a set of rules, which you see in the presentation, which individuated the cause of the disaster in the sinful behavior of the members of the community itself. Blame was attributed internally, and this led to a renovation of the moral fabric of the village. However, in Houthi discourse, the COVID-19 pandemic is not interpreted as the unintended consequence of sinful behavior, and it is not internally attributed. It is rather considered a purposeful attack perpetrated by external political enemies. Blame is thus externally attributed. America in particular is accused of having created the virus as a tool of biological warfare, and by extension, the Saudi-led coalition is held responsible for a potential spread of the virus in Yemen. The plausibility of such a theory is demonstrated by al-Houthi through historical parallels. Smallpox, he says, was transmitted to American Indians through contaminated blankets. Similarly, the US are suspected of spreading the infection in Yemen through contaminated humanitarian aid. The same trope was used by Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, one day after Abdul Malik al-Houth's speech. Iran and Hezbollah share with al-Houthi an ethical perspective on the pandemic. Al-Houthi asks rhetorically, why are some human beings damaging other human beings? And he replies, because of a moral value crisis. They got away from God, from divine values. Similarly, Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon has pointed out what he defines Western capitalism's monstrous decadence in humanity and morality in the handling of the coronavirus crisis. In Iran, Ali Khamenei has affirmed that, I quote, the spirit and basis of the social philosophy of the West rests on materialistic motives. For this reason, they have ignored the elderly, the sick, the poor, and individuals with various disabilities. This last point highlights that the coronavirus is interpreted as the epiphenomenon of an underlying problem, namely Western civilization. For al-Houthi, the pandemic is, I quote, a chance for the Islamic nation to introduce a developed model of civilization, to purify the international order from the catastrophes produced by evildoers. The consequences for Yemen and for the handling of the pandemic in Houthi-controlled areas are clarified by al-Houthi himself. The pandemic is framed in politico-military terms. Countering COVID-19 equals countering what he terms the aggression and the forces of evil, namely the United States and Israel. In his words, the virus of the aggression and the germs of betrayal, and not COVID-19, are the actual threat. The coronavirus is thus not an enemy in itself, but rather the enemy's weapon. Moreover, panic must be avoided, and it is defined by al-Houthi as a hostile action. This perspective has been recently echoed by Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, a member of the Supreme Political Council, who stated, revealing or hiding the number of those infected does not lessen or accelerate the spread of the virus, but it cuts back on widespread fear. Overall, in my view, al-Houthi's narrative serves three main functions. First, it clearly encourages recruitment and rank cohesion. Second, there is a profound awareness of the fact that the state wouldn't be able to provide effective health services. And rather than failing the citizens' expectations, the Houthi authorities blame the deteriorating humanitarian situation on external enemies, namely the coalition and international organizations, especially the UN. Third and last, this discourse clearly positions al-Houthi within the regional political arena next to his partners in the so-called axis of resistance, and it strengthens the idea of an alleged clash of civilizations. Thank you.